Hello everyone, this is Anugrah Rao. Welcome to the 11th episode of Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Millionlights is a TV channel dedicated to improving skills of people and their employability. Now, let me tell you more about Microsoft Art of Code. Microsoft Art of Code is a series of lectures, courses, and talks by experts who are going to discuss the latest Microsoft technologies, topics related to programming, and industry forecasts that are all focused on employability. As you know, we are learning HTML5 application development. And this is the third episode of this series. This course is basically for people pursuing computer science, but those who have basic knowledge of HTML and CSS and are interested in application development can join us as well. I hope you have watched our previous episodes of the series and previous courses on HTML5 and CSS3 fundamentals as well, because those episodes can help you to make you understand and learn easy. If you are looking to get started with web programming in HTML5, this is the right place. This episode for professional development, which provides a fast-paced and comprehensive introduction to learn HTML5, can definitely help you out. These episodes have everything you need to upgrade your skills. This content has been created by our partner Microsoft. We have Colin White, Supervisor of IT Academy programs from Microsoft with us. He is going to talk about how to create an application with HTML5. But before we start, you need to have a computer system with 64-bit processor or 32-bit processor. Other required tools are Windows Notepad and any web browser, such as Internet Explorer. Now, let's move towards the course. In the previous episodes, we covered the application lifecycle, building the user interface part 1 and building the user interface part 2, CSS Essentials part 1, CSS Essentials part 2. In this episode, we will cover the remaining part of module 5, that is CSS Essentials part 2. After that, we will move towards module 6, that is managing text flow by using CSS, in which we will learn to manage the flow of text content by using CSS from the HTML5 App Development Fundamentals exam. In module 7, that is managing the graphical interface by using CSS, we will learn to manage the graphical interface by using CSS from the HTML5 App Development Fundamentals exam. Implement graphic effects with CSS, including implementation of 2D and 3D transformations. So let's get started.
All right, so now we talked about the user interface. We talked about the box model. Let's talk about Flexboxes. Flexboxes are new in CSS3. CSS3 now includes the Flexbox box model. Try saying that 10 times fast. It's really hard. The Flexbox box model is a layout mode that provides flexibility when a user changes the size of their browser window. So you might start off with a browser window that's, I don't know, however many pixels wide this box is that I just drew. Well, if we expand the size of that window, sometimes we want our content to expand in order to fill it as well. And so you have certain elements like navigation bars, forms, and pictures. You want them to resize and reposition based on the amount of space that's available. We use something called media queries within CSS3 to help us determine which kind of device is being used. So then all the content on our page automatically adjusts our HTML document in order to fit the screen. Okay. So an element is defined as a flexbox using the display property. Okay, we'll go ahead and demo this here in just a little bit, but the display property possesses two values. You've got flexbox and inline flexbox. Okay, a flexbox is going to be a block level element, and then an inline flexbox is going to be an inline level element. And so what that means is that if it's inline, maybe you could set it inside of text. Whereas if it's block level, it's going to be on its own line of text unless you're using a float property to float it to the left or the right of the screen. I'm just real quickly going to review a couple of these Flexbox properties and values. You could definitely download these slides and check them out on your own. So if I do go too fast, I apologize, but download the slides and you can always give it a quick Bing search too, okay? So with the flex property, you can give it a positive value and a negative value. And so so you can make them flexible by height or width as well, right? And we'll demo this in just a second so you can see exactly what I mean. Go to the next slide here. You can actually also set the flex direction. So if you have elements like we do here with 1, 2, and 3, we can go ahead and set them so that they're set up in a row or a column, or we can go ahead and do a row reversal or a column reverse. So, you know, it would go 3, 2, 1 from the left to the right, or from top to bottom. Flex flow too. We also got to be, excuse me. We can set the direction or the flex wrap properties at the same time using flex flow. So flex flow is shorthand for the flex direction and flex wrap. And then we'll take a quick look at some others here. You can change the order of how the child boxes inside of a flex box appear on the screen with our flex order property. And then, like I had mentioned, flex wrap earlier, you can wrap your elements so that they drop down a line within the flex box too. So let's talk a little bit more about these using some visuals. I find it pretty helpful to always look at a picture. So when working with flex boxes, it's really important to know that a parent box can have a child box, right? This is part of what makes the Flexbox box model so awesome. Okay, with the flex property, we make the Flexbox items flexible as well. So when we increase the size of our parent box, we can also increase the size of each of our child boxes. The flex property is used to, I guess you'd say, and I actually nailed it on the head in the slide, to proportionally scale the Flexbox items when its parent box increases or decreases in size. So if we decrease the size of that parent box, we would shrink the size of the element, the children elements. So you guys, all these tongue twisters are getting me tired, so I do apologize. You can also change the direction of child items, right? Like we had mentioned before. And so we use the flex direction property in order to do that. You can go back and take a look at the table that featured the row reverse, column, and column reverse values to learn a little bit more about that. The flex wrap property, which is shown here, makes the third child, if the screen size shrinks, right, from the left to right in this instance, you can make the third child drop down a line, right? And we can do that with the wrap value. The flex flow property sets the flex direction once again, and the flex wrap properties at the same time. I think when you're getting started, it's really important to use flex direction and flex wrap so that you understand exactly what's happening before you start using the flex flow property and going with shorthand there, okay? Let's go ahead and take a quick look at a Flexbox demo now. So I'm going to jump over to Webmatrix. Go ahead and maximize this so you can see it. And we're going to open up the Flexbox demo, okay? So let's take a quick look at this code here. So I use the display property, as we mentioned in a previous slide, with the MS prefix here for Flexbox in order to make, or rather, in order to create an ID that can be applied with Flexbox properties, right? So if I go down to my code here, I've created a div that we've labeled as my Flexbox, right? So here, my Flexbox is the ID, and we've assigned that ID to this parent div. So now we've got our Flexbox items on the inside, and I'm gonna have 2 that are ID'd with child blue, and then 2 that are green. Actually, that's not even correct. Because I have 2, I should make these a class, okay? So I'm gonna fix that error in my code right now. And we're going to make sure that we apply classes and not IDs. IDs should be applied to unique elements. Just how it goes, right? Each one of us is unique. So we want to make sure that we're identified as such. And I'm sure if our HTML elements could talk, they would probably feel the same way. Maybe with JavaScript, we will make them talk later. But that's a different lesson. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I save that by hitting Control S. And now I've got 4 different children items that'll fit inside this Flexbox here, okay? So Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set up the flex direction as row. So I'm going to cut these guys out. I just had them there so that we can demo that in our slide. And then I'm going to go ahead and set up for wrap so you can see what happens. I've set the color, the background color of the Flexbox as gray, and then our height as auto in order to make sure that we fit each of the children elements. So let's launch this in the browser. And there we have all 4 of our Flexbox items inside of the larger Flexbox. So it's pretty cool stuff. So now if I shrink this, look at what happens. The top left corner of the browser is 1, then 2, then 3, and 4 went ahead and wrapped around to the bottom. Let's see what happens with 3. Oh, same thing when we decrease the size of our browser. So Flexboxes are pretty darn cool. They definitely help us make the most of our screen space, no matter the size of our screen. So let's go ahead and let's mess with this and see what happens if we apply the row reversed value to our flex direction property. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page now. Whoops. Row reverse. And now we've reversed the order of our flex boxes. So now we're going from 4, 3, 2, 1. And then, of course, if we go ahead and we change this to column, all of a sudden we're going to see, let me pop that up a little bit. Forgot to save. Now we're going to see all of our children of our Flexbox items being displayed in a column. And of course, you can reverse that as well. Remember that the wrap value for the flex wrap property allows us to make sure that if we decrease the size of our screen, our Flexbox items will drop down to the next line and they'll wrap around to the next line. Okay? All right. Flexboxes is pretty awesome. You can also order and arrange the content inside of a Flexbox by using the flex order property, right? The default value for the flex order property is 0 for each of the elements, and if you go ahead and increase that value, the higher the value is, the more the order will change. So in this particular example, we have apple, orange, and pear all have a property value of 0, a flex order property value of 0. And so with the parent, if we change the value of orange to 1 and then leave apple at 0 and pear at 0, then orange will all of a sudden move to the front, right? So it's a good way to reorganize and rearrange the different Flexbox items. Okay. If you want to learn more about Flexboxes, go ahead and take a quick look at this link. And let me go ahead and go back to my pointer here. It's not letting me do it. All right, we'll have to go and take a look at that link here in just a second. There we go, got it. Don't know what was going on there, but we'll go ahead and we'll load up Internet Explorer slowly but surely. And here it is. The Microsoft Developer Network has a really, really great tutorial on Flexboxes, and I strongly suggest that you walk through it and experiment with your own code. It'll help you a lot in terms of learning this content. All right, next thing's next. Grid layouts. Grid layouts are wonderful, right? The Flexbox model is wonderful for simple, flexible layouts, but when you need to go more complex, you can use the grid layout model. And so the grid layout model is very similar. I guess I think of it as a kind of like an Excel spreadsheet, right? It's got columns and rows, and so it makes it really easy to organize your content based in the way that you like, right? That you want your user interface to appear for your users. Grids are extremely flexible, and they provide an easier to I guess, an easier to use option for organizing content than I guess HTML tables would. You guys remember how big of a headache HTML tables seemed like in our second module, or maybe it was our third, I can't remember. But you know, this is a much easier way to organize your content. And I'll show you here in just a second when we demo grid layouts. So grid layouts and grid items, right? Grid layouts, very similar to tables because they do have those rows and columns, but they're modular and it allows you to move content from one part of the page to another with pretty great ease. Okay, and so here's an example of a grid layout over on the right. You have your masthead, which is like that huge picture and maybe some text that you see when you enter a splash page. And you've got navigation on the side, on the left side, with 3 columns for your display, and then footer at the bottom, right? That's sort of a standard and typical website layout. We define the grid layout by using the display property along with the grid or inline grid values. And so similar to how we use the display property with the Flexbox, we just use it with grid. And so the child elements in a grid, you know, similar to Flexboxes, are called grid items, and they can be positioned according to grid tracks, grid lines, or grid cells. And you can take a look at what grid tracks, grid lines, and grid cells are there on your own in the table below. Here's some different grid properties and values. I'm not going to go ahead and take too much time to detail this. You can go ahead and download the slides. I'll definitely point you in the direction of a Microsoft Developer Network article for grid layouts, and that'll help you really understand all these different properties and values for grids. All right, let's take a look at a demo here real fast. Accidentally just exited out of my presentation, so you have to bear with me, but let's take a look at the grid demo. So I'm going to make this full screen now. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at our code. So what I've done is I've created a div element here called gridded. I just gave it an ID of gridded, right? It's got 2 child elements inside of it, one with the ID item1 and then one with the ID item2. Okay. In my CSS, I've gone through and I've added the ID selector for gridded, and I've set the display property to a value of MSGrid like I had mentioned. I set the background gray so it's a little bit easier to see. And then now we've got the grid columns property, which we use to make our columns. So here I've set it to auto, and what'll happen is it'll make 5 columns. And CSS will automatically size those columns based on the width of my browser window, right? So whether I'm on a phone or whether I happen to be on a laptop, it's going to go ahead and it's going to automatically size all of those columns for me, which is really convenient because it means way less work for me. Can you imagine doing that with tables? I can't. I feel like it would be a bit of a headache. Next, we take a look at our grid rows, and here you see that I've defined 3 different rows. So I've got essentially what amounts to a grid of 5 columns and 3 rows. I've used the fraction units. So what this is 2 fractions of the page space that's available or of the document window. And so here, each of these rows is just 2 fractions. And we'll play with that in just a little bit so that you can see how changing this number will impact the size of a cell in the grid. Okay. Item 1 is orange. It's going to be located in row 1, column 1. And then item 2 is purple, and it's going to be located in row 2, column 2. Okay, so let's go ahead and launch in the browser. And there it is, right? So we see item 1 up top and item 2 down below. And let's pull this over so we can take a look at our source code. I apologize, things are not snapping correctly for me today, so do bear with me as I make adjustments. All right, so see located in 1-1 here, we've got item 1, which is orange, item 2, nothing's in the 3rd row, which is great. If I go up here and I change the fraction size, so maybe I make this 10 fractions, We'll go ahead and save that and then refresh the page. Let's see what happens. All of a sudden you see that we increase the height of the row, which means that we increase the height of the element that happens to be in it since we didn't define the height previously. Okay, so that's how grids work. It's just a basic introduction. You can do so much with a grid layout. I definitely suggest that you go ahead and take a look at that on your own time. And let me actually show you an article here that you can use to access a little bit more information about grids. All right, so right here, let me pop this back up real fast. If you click that, it'll pop up an Internet Explorer here. Once again, just a ton of information that's available for you from the Microsoft Developer Network. This is such a great, rich resource, and you see that we're on CSS right now. I strongly recommend checking out this entire CSS section. It's really helpful. Just take all the information that they give you, all these code snippets, play with them and experiment, and that'll help you learn and understand this stuff the best. There really is no better way to learn than to just figure things out by playing around, right? So. All right. So we're all done for this module. Let's do a quick recap here. We talked about the user interface, the CSS box model, the Flexbox box model. Once again, say it 10 times fast, and grid layouts. That's all we've got right now for this module, but we'll see you back in the next one in just a little bit. All right, welcome back to Module 6. This is HTML5 Application Development Fundamentals, and I'm Cullen. We're going to dive in right now to managing text flow by using CSS, okay? Go ahead and get started here. All right, we're going to cover Objective 3.3, manage the flow of text content by using CSS. In doing that, we're going to focus on CSS regions, columns, and hyphenation, and then also CSS exclusions. Got a couple of great demos for you, too, to show you the power of each of those things. So we'll get started with CSS regions. So with HTML, you can organize content into separate sections, but what can you do if you want content to flow from one region to another? And the answer to this is CSS regions. There's sections of a document where content can flow, right? So if we got region 1, let me go ahead and pull up a pen here. If I've got, whoops, sorry guys. Okay, if I've got region 1 here, I have a bunch of content that flows through region 1. Well, let's say that I want that content to wrap and come over here to region 2. But let's say there's so much content in region 2, I want it to wrap over to region 3 as well. Well, I can do that with CSS regions, and they can be placed anywhere on a screen, as evidenced by this graphic here, which makes them that much cooler. All right, so you can implement CSS regions by using the flow into and flow from properties. Before you can do that, though, you have to specify a content source and then also content containers. So, here, if you take a look at the code example down below, a content source is actually going to be a separate HTML file. And this can be kind of confusing, so I'll show you what I mean by that in a demo. But we're actually going to pull content directly from another HTML file into this one. And from there, we're going to put it into each of these different regions, right? So these right here are our content containers, right? They're the areas where you want your content to appear. And you should definitely, once again, use a separate HTML document for your content. It'll make your life so much easier. All right, so how do we use these flow from and flow into properties? What we're going to do is we're going to use an ID as a selector for our content, right, for that div. And then we're going to use the flow into property and set the value as main. Then for each of our regions, we're going to identify them with a class, right? And from there, we're going to use flow from. Now we're going to set that flow from properties value to main as well. And these two things here, for our region and for our content, are going to be the same exact value. Okay? This is how the source and the content are associated with each other and how we make sure that it flows into and it flows from the same place, or rather the specified place. In this case, it's main. And then just a couple of quick lines for our demo code here. Background, we set it as gray, if I recall correctly. I don't know if that is actually the hexadecimal for gray, but we've got our width and our height are just 150 pixels by 200 pixels. We're floating each of our regions to the left, and then our margin, there's a little bit of buffer space between each of our regions, okay? Another quick note too, we had talked about overflowed text as well. It's really important that you guys understand how this works with CSS regions. For me, it wasn't rendering properly on this browser when I tried it earlier, and sometimes it doesn't, even if you do use the vendor prefixes. And there's some conflicting information out there about what to use and how to use overflow versus the region fragment. Excuse me, the region fragment property. So just make sure that you do a quick Bing search, discern what kind of information is good, check the Microsoft Developer Network, and make a really good educated decision. And of course, do my favorite thing to learn, experiment, 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 and you'll get it right. Try all sorts of different browsers. And you'll definitely make sure that you have visible overflow if necessary, or you can even set it to truncate the text too, okay? Another thing that you can do is also just cut off, or sorry, just allow the height of each of the regions to be set automatically so that you don't have overflow, okay? So, moving on, another quick thing to point out is that with Internet Explorer, you're actually going to implement CSS regions differently than how you would for other browsers like Firefox or a Google Chrome. Okay, we're going to use the iframe tag, and so note here that I'm using iframes. Everything else is very, very, very similar to our example here, except here we use divs. Okay, all that we're doing is just changing those tags. Everything else is the exact same, okay? Yeah, nothing changes at all. So let's go ahead and take a look at CSS regions in action and run over to a quick demo here, okay? All this code, of course, is included inside of the slideshow, so you can go ahead and take a look at that on your own time. Unfortunately, I have it listed as overflow examples, so we'll update that so when you download it, these slides are all correct, okay? All right. Let's pull up Webmatrix. We'll take a quick look at our code for regions. Note exactly as I had mentioned with the iframe here, I've got 4 different regions, right? They're all assigned the region class, so keep that in mind. What I've done here is exactly like what we had previously discussed as well, so no surprises. I will show you though that we've got content HTML. I'm going to show you that HTML page, right? So here we have this HTML document. I just used lorem ipsum text. And note, same structure as your typical HTML document. All content is included inside the body tags. But what we're going to do is we're going to import all of this content into our regions, and so it's pretty cool to check out. Let's do it. Let's go ahead and launch it in the browser, and there you'll see we have 4 columns of our text. We set it as float early, so each of the regions are gonna go ahead and drop down to a next line when we decrease the size of our browser window, right? When they run out of room. And let's see here if that content was truncated at all. Of course, with the lorem ipsum text, we are going to have some challenges in determining whether or not the text got truncated. And it definitely looks like it did, right? Here it is, it got cut off and it's hidden. So let's take a look at that now. We have region fragment set, and I apologize here, I'm going to resize my window for you. We have region fragment set as auto, so it should automatically handle the situation for us since we have overflow set as visible, but unfortunately it's not. So like I had mentioned earlier, sometimes you're going to swing and miss and things aren't going to render properly, and that's okay. It's part of being on the cutting edge of HTML5 and CSS3, and so just keep trying at it, stay updated, and check out the Microsoft Developer Network if you're having any trouble. All right, we'll head back to our presentation now. Let's talk about columns and hyphenation. So columns and hyphenation are, well, rather columns are pretty similar to regions, except we're just creating a multi-column layout, right? We've got three primary CSS properties that are used in order to manipulate columns. We have our column count, we have our column gap, and then we have our column rule. In the CSS box, columns are between the content and the box, right? And so what we're saying is a column would be, column would be here and here, right? All right, so a couple of column properties that are really important to review along with their values. There's break after, break before, break inside, column count, column fill, column gap. Column count is the one that we're going to be using right now. You can also fill the columns sequentially, right? So column fill is useful for that. We also want to go ahead and make sure that we pay attention to all the ones posted here with the column rule. We've got column rule color, which will specify the color of the rule between the columns and whether or not there's a line, sort of like the red one that I drew earlier, right? And finally, column width and then columns. Columns is shorthand for setting the column count and the column width. All right, so let's take a look at how we would use hyphenation, and then we'll get on to a demo here. So when you're using columns, you want the text to cover the entirety of a column versus having words wrap around to the next line, right? If you want that to be the case, then you can enable hyphenation. Hyphenation is simply just the process of using a hyphen, connecting two parts of the same word based on their syllables, right? Implement hyphenation, you just use the hyphens property along with three different values, and you have auto, manual, or none. Auto and manual will enable hyphenation, and then none would prevent it, right? So here I just went ahead and set it as auto. Notice that I use the vendor prefixes for everything along with hyphens itself in case a prefix isn't needed. One thing to note, though, about using hyphens is that if you want your text to automatically be hyphenated, you need to set the language in your browser, or sorry, not in your browser, but in your HTML document. And you just do that inside of the HTML tag with the lang attribute. For English, just set the value to EN. You can go ahead and just do a quick Bing search if you're looking to set it up for any other languages. That's the best, quickest, and most efficient way that I've found if I want to set my browser or my HTML language to French, or even to, I think Pirate English is also available if I'm not mistaken. I might be though. It's been a while since I've tried to use that for my HTML documents. So, all right, let's take a quick look at columns in action, right? Let's do a quick demo here. And take this full screen. All right, so notice we've got a three columns class. Then we also have hyphenize as our class for anything that we want to have hyphens. We're going to take a quick gander here. So we have three columns. We've just set up a single div. It has two children elements inside of it. Both paragraph elements, right, with our lorem ipsum text. And what we've done is we've applied the three columns class and the hyphenized class to both, or rather to this div. And so note with three columns, we get a width of 300 pixels for each column, right? Then we have the column count. Actually, I need to change that to MS. Right, for our Microsoft browser. We may not even need the prefix, but I just realized that we're using Internet Explorer and not Chrome. And so we set our column count to 3, right, because we're making a web page with 3 columns. Same thing with column count there. And finally, for hyphenize, what we've done is we've just set the value of hyphens, the hyphens property, to auto. Okay. Go ahead and launch that in the browser here. And there we go. We've got 3 columns. There's no height, so of course the text is going to run all the way to the end there. You see our break right here between our different paragraph elements. But all that content has just fit inside of 3 different columns. And of course we can change the width of the columns or even set the height. But then of course we may have to worry about overflow. So what happens if we change, let's get rid of width and just do a quick little experimentation here. All right. Whoops. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to refresh the browser. And all of a sudden notice that all of our content is just automatically sized, right? So we just said 3 columns no matter how wide the browser is, which is pretty darn cool. I like it. Notice our hyphens are still there. Very cool stuff. Very cool stuff. All right, so let's go back to our presentation here. We're going to talk about CSS exclusions. Now, I had a problem with running the demo for this earlier, so we're probably going to skip it in this presentation, but I will point you to some really helpful information that you can use and access to experiment with CSS exclusions. An exclusion is commonly referred to as a position float, and I probably should have bolded the terms position float, right? It allows you to place an element in a specific location on a web page. So what we do is, let's say we have this blue rectangle right here, right? And I want to just place it smack dab in the center of my my web page. What happens then is that all of the text that's on the page and any other elements will wrap around it. And so you notice you have the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. So we're still all on the same line here with our text, but it's just simply wrapping around this blue rectangle. Exclusions can be created in a ton of different shapes too. They can be in circles, triangles, all sorts of things. Here I just picked a rectangle because I really like saying rectangle. No, I'm just joking. I have no idea why I picked a rectangle. Probably because it was the example that was given by the Microsoft Developer Network. Another plug for their site. All right. You can declare an exclusion by using the wrap flow property, featured right there, and its preferred value. So we said both, right? That makes sure that there's wrap around each side of it, each side of the element. You can modify the shape using the shape outside and shape inside properties. I didn't choose to do that here in this particular example code, but it's important to note that an exclusion may not be supported by all browsers, so I'm still using my vendor prefixes, right? So I still use the Microsoft vendor prefix. So keep that in mind. You always want to make sure that we do everything that we can to make sure that our web pages and our apps render properly in browsers. All right, so quick overview of all the properties for CSS exclusions. And really what I'm going to do here is just tell you to go ahead and download this presentation to go ahead and review them. They very well may be tested on the HTML application development fundamentals exam. So it's really important to take a good hard look at them. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and point you to that Microsoft Developer Network article on CSS exclusions. Take a look right here. There's that image that I pulled from. But you can go ahead and read much more about the exclusion element. Pretty fun stuff, pretty interesting, and definitely a really neat feature to add to your user interface. So check that out. That's all we've got for this module. Quick recap. You've learned about CSS regions. We've learned about how to implement columns and hyphenation. And also, we talked about CSS exclusions. Hope to see you guys again for our next module real soon. And, keep learning. All right, welcome back. I'm Cullen. We're going to go ahead and keep on going through our fantastic HTML5 voyage here. We're coming back with Module 7 of HTML5 Application Development Fundamentals. And that means that we're going to review how to manage a graphical interface using CSS. More specifically, we're going to check out how to implement graphic effects and also look at 2D and 3D transformations, which are super fun. And I do mean super. All right, so some new effects in CSS3. You can now round corners on objects, which is exciting, right? You can make things transparent with ease. This is 50% transparent over here. You can also give things shadows, like this lovely rectangle here. And then you can also animate objects as well, right? Like this circle. I thought I'd throw a circle in there for good measure. Just like that, right? Make them bounce out of here. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started and talk about how to implement these graphic effects. You can create rounded corners with just a couple of properties, actually one property more specifically. But you can also modify and round individual corners. So you use the border radius property along with the length value such as pixels, ems, or a percentage. And the higher that pixel value is, the more rounded the corners will appear. Okay. Keep in mind that some browsers are going to have problems with rendering a percentage value, so it's probably a better idea to stick with pixels and ems when placing units in there. Like I mentioned, you can also go ahead and round individual corners with the border top left radius property and border top right, border bottom right, and then border bottom left. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at how you do that in Webmatrix. Okay. So real quickly here, just got some basic code. I'm going to drop this guy down and show a little bit more code on my screen. Probably should have done that earlier, huh? Oh, wow, the things you forget when you get old. So here, we're going to go ahead and identify a block. This guy right here is the div. It's block 1. We've got hello world, I am a block. We're actually going to use this code to show you how to round borders. And we're also going to go ahead and show you how to use gradients too, but that comes in just a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change the class here to my rounded class. I'm going to save my file and let's take a look at the CSS real quickly. Note that the border radius here set just as in our example of 20 pixels, 20 pixels, 20 pixels, 20 pixels. I gave it a shadow, and I'm not going to let you guys see that shadow yet. That's not fair. I'm going to comment that out. And then, of course, the background of this square or this block is going to be yellow. Okay, so let's launch it in the browser, and there it is. Uh-oh. Got a little bit of a rendering problem there. Our text is sticking outside of our block, and I can go ahead and fix that real quickly here. I'm going to add some padding. We talked about that a little bit earlier when we reviewed the CSS box model. I'm going to go ahead and add. Let's do 15 pixels and see what that does for us. Okay. Let's go back to our browser. Whoops. All right, let's go ahead and refresh the page and see what happens. And there we go. We fixed our problem, right? Hello world, I am a block is no longer cut off by our awesome rounded corners. So pretty easy stuff, right? I know you've been probably adding rounded corners to your shapes in PowerPoint for years. And now CSS finally allows you to catch up in your web documents a little bit more easily as well, right? All right, so let's talk about creating shadows. So let's go back to this slide right here, right? Our friend with the shadow, that's what we're going to do. It may not look exactly like that, but gosh darn it, we're going to try. All right, so you can add drop shadows to elements using the box shadow property. A drop shadow is just a visual effect that makes an object appear like it's floating, sort of like light is shining on the object, and then providing a shadow in the background, right? There are 6 different attributes that can be modified when using the box shadow property, and those are H shadow, which is your horizontal positioning of the shadow, or how far off how far off from the shape itself the shadow is horizontally. The vertical shadow, which is how far off the shadow is vertically from the shape. Then you have your blur level, your spread, and then your color. And then finally you have inset as well. Today we're going to go ahead and show you just H shadow, V shadow, blur, and then color as well. Okay. All right. Real quick overview of each of those different attributes. Give you a couple of seconds to take a look at that. Don't forget that you can download these slides as well and go ahead and review these. Quick Bing search never hurts to just search for box shadow attributes, CSS. All right. Let's go ahead and demo that shadow now. I'll finally go back and uncomment the box shadow. Let's add a beautiful shadow to our lovely rounded block here. Okay, so all I did was I've got the box shadow property. I've added that to the rounded class, right, to the selector. And now we're going to go ahead and offset it horizontally by 10 pixels, vertically by 10 pixels, blur it by 8 pixels, and then go ahead and use the 808080 hexadecimal code. And that should give me some variant of gray. Of course, we'll see. If I'm wrong, don't hold it against me. So I'm going to refresh here, and there it is. Pretty cool. So now what happens if I make these H shadow values negative? I'm going to go ahead and save my file. Always kind of just wonder things, right? And no better way to learn than to experiment. Here I've got, I'm going to exit out of these old windows. Still have to refresh. And if I do that, notice what happens, right? The orientation, or rather the positioning of the shadow changes. The placement of the shape on the page does not, though. Really, really important to make sure that you remember that, okay? But go and experiment with these values. Have some fun. Get wild with shadows. I don't even know if that's really possible. Anyway, let's talk about applying transparency now. All right. In addition to the rounded corners and also to shadows, we can make shapes more transparent. Or rather, we can add a transparency effect to a shape, right, or to an element. And so we do that with the opacity property, right? Opacity determines how transparent an object appears, and the value for this property should be somewhere between 0 and 1. And so 1 means that the object is entirely opaque. And let me just highlight this real fast, just like our friend right here. Whereas if we decrease that value, you see that it becomes more and more transparent, right? And I'll show you what that looks like here in just a second with CSS, right? Here's just a quick recap. We use that border radius, we use box shadow, and now we're going to go ahead and we're going to add opacity, okay? Let's go with 0.2 as our value. Let's see what happens to that lovely yellow. So notice that our shadow is still there. Our shadow is also a little bit more transparent too, which I think is super interesting. I think it's really cool that we were able to do that with the opacity property. But everything else you just see. If another thing that I really want to make sure that we point out is that if you added another element and that element happened to be overlapped by this relatively transparent element, what you would see is that element in the background. And it's really, really important that you make sure that you remember that, because that overlap could cause an effect that might not be pleasing to a user. So do keep that in mind, okay? All right, and actually let me go ahead and show you really fast what that would look like. So if I find the slide that we were just on, I apologize, I don't want to take too much of your time, but if I add this and then I send this to the back, Notice that this object sits on top, and you can actually see through this object in order to see the entirely opaque shape right here. Now, if I change the color of this shape in order to further demonstrate this point, it makes it a little bit easier to see, right? If it's the same color, it doesn't really have the same effect, but you can see that this shape is overlaid on top of the shape in the background, and that's going to that could potentially rather cause some problems later on, okay? So keep in mind as you guys are developing your web pages to use opacity wisely, okay? All right. So back to our presentation. Let's talk about background gradients. A gradient is a smooth transition from one color to another. And in CSS3, you can apply gradients to just about anything, right? Headers, footers, buttons, shapes, vector graphics. They're applied through the background property, and then you actually use methods, right? So if I have the background property in use, I'm going to add in linear gradient as a value. So if I have linear gradient right here, I would add that in as a value. And then there's some other coding that I have to do in order to make best use of that method. So to give you guys an idea of how linear gradients function, they can be from the top to the bottom, from bottom to top, or from corner to corner, or even side to side. A default gradient is going to go from top to bottom, okay? How we implement this is kind of tricky. It's very different from the way that we implement a lot of our other properties within CSS3, and so the best way to explain this is to actually just show you an example, okay? So give me a quick second here and I'll switch over and we'll show you an example. All right, so we've got our code up on screen now, and I'm going to change the class for my block from rounded to gradiented. I'm pretty sure that that's not even a word, and of course I misspelled it. I can't verify that for you, but it is important to make sure that you use names for your classes and for your IDs that aren't the same as some of the properties that you're using or some of the keywords that you'll use, right? Like you wouldn't want to make an ID for HTML called P for a P tag, or called H1 for an H1 tag. It just wouldn't be a good idea. So let's go ahead and take a look at this code though in action. I'm going to make sure I save it first. Launch the browser there. And here you have a block, right, with gradiented. Let's take a look at our CSS here, okay? And let's talk about what this does. So right now, we've got this beautiful block. It goes to top, which means that it starts from the bottom. It starts as a white, and it's completely white until it hits the 20% mark. At that point, it starts transitioning gradually to blue until it hits the 80% mark, where it's going to be entirely blue from there, okay? We can go ahead, if we change this from top to bottom and then save, I'm gonna refresh the page, and all of a sudden I flip the gradient, okay? Super cool. It's a tiny little touch. Let's take a look at a couple of other things too. If I'm not mistaken, and I might be wrong, I might have to go back and check. You can also, let's do 110 degrees. I think that you can add in a degree as a property in order to change the gradient. Yeah, and there it is, right? So I've done the same thing, but I've started up in this top left corner at 110 degrees, and then the gradient moves down towards the right corner. So pretty cool stuff. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and comment this out now. And then I'm going to uncomment this next example before I actually go on to talk about it on our presentation. All right, so next we'll talk about radial gradients, right? They start from the center of an object and then they radiate outwards. And they actually can take different shapes. They can either be like a perfect circle or they can be an ellipse, which is sort of like an oval, right? And we're talking about a rudimentary definition there. The first values with the radial gradient method are going to determine the horizontal and vertical center values, so where the gradient is going to start. So let's take a look at that in action, okay? So we're gonna use the same colors, white and blue. Sorry if that gets boring. I have no idea why I picked them, just because. All right, so I'm gonna make sure to save this, and then we're gonna pop open our browser window, and we're gonna go ahead and refresh. And there we have an awesome radial gradient. And notice I said ellipse at center, but if I change those values, let's do 10 and then 10, and let's see what happens here. Uh-oh, I messed up. Oh. Now I'm just hitting all sorts of combinations of things that I don't want to hit. All right. Let me actually go back to my presentation because I may have made a mistake, and honestly, guys, I can't recall. If you ever run into a situation like this, all I would do is stop what you're doing, go to Bing, right, bing.com, and do a quick search for the property. It'll be super helpful. You'll easily find your way out of a jam. I'm going to move forward because sometimes that's what basically you should just do, right? And with that being said, let's move on to talk about 2D and 3D transformations. So graphic effects are awesome, but at the end of the day, you know, they're not as cool. Like I said, we've been using these in PowerPoints forever and Word documents forever. And so, you know, what is really fascinating, what is really engaging is when we add 2D and 3D transformations. So like any kind of animation or something along those lines that changes an object from its original shape or form. All right, without further ado, you know, a transform, we'll start there, the basic definition. It's an effect that lets you change the size, shape, and position of an element. This includes just basically rotating, scaling, stretching, spinning, and moving elements. To add transformations, all you have to do is add the transform property with one of its methods. An important thing to understand is that transform by itself is not going to implement an animation. In fact, you actually have to use a key, oh, I forget the name. We'll talk about it here in just a second, I promise you. I'm starting to lose it, guys. So keep following me, okay? But you don't animate, you just transform. So when you refresh a page, the element itself transforms from the way that you had it initially in its code, but a user's never going to see that transformation. Really important there. There are tons of different methods that are involved with the transform property, and we're only going to cover a few of them today, okay? Like I've said before, you know, go to Bing, look for the Microsoft Developer Network, and do a quick lookup for the transform property. It'll be super helpful. All right, so let's get started with translations. 2D translations are going to move elements without rotating, skewing, or turning the image, right? All that it does is it moves it from its original location to a brand new location. And let's go ahead and take a quick look at a demo for translations. So I'm gonna increase the size of my Webmatrix window, snap it, open up my transforms demo. Let's see here. And then I want you guys to see that I've actually got all of my CSS stored inside of a transforms.css file. So what I'm going to do is we're going to walk through all these transitions, and I've actually got an animation here, so get pretty excited for that one. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the class each and every time. I may have to come back and check the class name to make sure I'm implementing it correctly, but this is really the benefit of using a CSS file and then linking that file to your HTML file, okay, to your HTML document. So I open this up. I'm going to double check my link to make sure that I've properly linked to my CSS file, right? Transforms.css. Note that transforms.css is in the same file folder as my transforms.demo.html file, so I don't need to add a folder name. If transforms.css happened to be in, say, managing text flow, I would have to go ahead and add that name, you know, managing underscore text flow, and then a /. And that would allow me to properly link it in a different folder. So something to keep in mind for later. Not tested on the exam, but exceptionally important whenever you're creating web apps and web pages. Anyway, all right, back to the topic of transforms. I'm going to go ahead and we want to add the translated class, okay? Because that's where my transform property is being used. All right, so I've got a square here that's going to appear on the page, and it says, of course, "Hi, I'm square," or "I'm a square." Probably would have been funnier if it said "Hi, I'm square," but here what I've done is with the translated class, I've moved this element from its original position on the left all the way to the right. And if I actually just delete this class, save the file, and refresh, you see where the square was positioned initially. Okay, and so now I go back, oops, type transform instead of translated. If I go back and I refresh the page, you see here all I've done is I've just moved it over to the right. A user's never even going to know that that happened. It's just going to be there in the code. Okay, really important piece of information to recall. All right, so moving on. Let's talk about scaling. Scaling an element, all that it does is it increases or decreases its size. Once again, we use the transform property along with the scale method, and it just accepts two basic values. It's got a factor to adjust its width and a factor to adjust its height. Okay, width is going to increase by 2 times. Height is going to increase by 2 times in this case. So let's go take a look real fast in Webmatrix. I'm going to go ahead and open up Internet Explorer. Let's take a look here. All right, so you see that the object has increased in size. I actually have to go back and take a look at my CSS here. So if I look at scaled, oh, I didn't increase it by a factor of 2 and 2. I just increased it by a factor of 1 and 2. So now if I save that CSS file, notice that the change has occurred there. Okay. All right. So next up, we'll go ahead and rotate. Right? So you're going to go ahead and use the rotate method with the transform property and then insert the number of degrees. So I'm going to go back and add the rotated class to my transforms demo here. I'm going to launch the browser and do a quick refresh, and there you have a rotation of 45 degrees. Some pretty cool stuff, right? You have to think pretty carefully about how you want to implement these different transitions or transforms. And so, don't just do it arbitrarily. It's really important. We've also got some 3D rotations that you can do, and what happens is with these 3D rotations is you rotate it along an axis. So here we rotate along the x-axis, and notice that the shape appears a little bit smaller than it is. Same thing here, but what's happening is we're rotating the shape around a particular axis, right? So we're moving it so that it appears like it has depth. Unfortunately, on a screen, sometimes it's not going to be the case. 2D skewing. You can use skewing, or rather you can skew a shape or an element by using the skew method. It's going to accept two different values. There's a number of degrees to turn the object around the x-axis, and then the number of degrees to turn it around the y-axis. And so what happens is we will have already turned this shape around, and I'm not doing a very good job of drawing there. We turn it around the y-axis and then back around the x-axis. Definitely go ahead and do a quick Bing search for this. I think that you can probably find some better animations than what I'm providing you with right now. So don't be afraid to do that, okay? All right, next, we got transitions, okay? A transition is a visible movement from one state to another on screen. And so to create a transition, you want to use the transition property and then set the value as the property that you would like to change. Okay, so we're going to change our background, and what we're going to do is that's going to occur, or we're going to implement that transition whenever we hover over an object. And I've added, whoops. I've added, notice that that hover declaration there, okay? Or sorry, I've added hover to the selector, okay? So this can be done with the transition property or by using specific properties for each. I'm going to demo this in just a second, but you have transition, transition property, transition delay. Transition is a shorthand for all four of the other properties below. Definitely use the individual properties first before you go on to use transition as a shorthand. It's a great way just to make sure that you know exactly what you're doing first. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a quick look and do a demo here. So I'm going to transition the background here of an element when I hover over it. Oh, transitions is already there. So we're going to do this with a button that's on the screen. Okay, you guys have probably been wondering, why is that random button there? This is why. And looks like I need to open this back up again in the browser. Oh, look at that. That's exciting. It's really exciting. Okay, so all that happens is when I hover over the button, it slowly transitions to a different color of orange. Okay. And so you can see in the CSS, what I've done is I've got my transition property. I set it as background. The transition duration is over a time period of 2 seconds. And I can go ahead, if I wanted to change this to blue, I could do that and just type the actual name for it. And then if I open this back up again, in the browser, now you see that it transforms to blue. Right. All right, so next, let's talk about animations. Transforming is static. It happens. A user might not be knowledgeable of it. Animations, on the other hand, make objects or make elements on a page appear as though they're moving. And so unlike transitions, we've actually got to implement a rule here called the keyframes rule. And that allows you to adjust the timing of an animation. And so what this one's going to do is we're going to move from a blue background into a yellow highlight 50% of the way there, and then we're going to transition to red to finish out. And so our animation name here is glow, which has to be the same as the selector name, which is preceded by the keyframes rule. Okay, and this is what I was mentioning earlier and couldn't quite recall for whatever reason. But then notice that I've got my animation duration is 5 seconds. So let's go ahead and see this in action here real quickly. So I'm going to add Oh, real fast before I show you that quick demo, here are all the properties in isolation. Really important to take a look at those after you download the slides. Okay. Oh, before we move on, let's take a look at that demo real quickly. I don't know why I typed glow. I want to type animated. I'm going to save my file, and then I'm going to launch it in the browser. And look at that. We've animated the square. Went from blue to yellow to red. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you end a presentation, okay? As a quick recap for everything that we talked about today, we reviewed graphic effects, then 2D and 3D transformations. Thanks for joining me once again. I look forward to seeing you during our next module where we start talking about JavaScript.
That's all for this episode. I hope this tutorial was helpful. In the next episode, we will move forward with Module 8, that is Understanding JavaScript and Coding Essentials. Is your mind ringing with questions, queries, or doubts? Do you wish to learn more? Then visit our website www.millionlights.org and post your questions on our forum. We will be really happy to clear all your doubts. If you missed anything and want to rewatch it, you can download it from our website or can watch online as well. You can also participate in our webinars, discussions with the subject experts, as well as get Microsoft certification on various courses through our website. You can also find us on Facebook by the name Millionlights as well as on Twitter. For more such interesting tutorials on coding, keep watching Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Thank you.